C-SPAN podcast.
Now a Senate hearing on relations between Muslims and the West. You'll hear from the president of the Pew Research Center, whose annual project measures Western and Muslim opinions. Chaired by Senator Lugar of Indiana, this is 2 hours.
This hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is called to order. The committee meets today to convene the second in a series of hearings on the issue of global terrorism and our national and international efforts to combat it. The issue regrettably remains very much in the headlines. Just last week, commuters in Bombay experienced the spontaneous and tragic consequences of terrorism. As tensions flare and more lives are lost in the volatile Middle East, terrorist acts continue to be a tactic of those wishing to achieve political objectives. In our first hearing, we heard from both current and former senior government officials on the state of the terrorist threat against the United States, and we received recommendations for measuring success and moving forward. We learned that while there have been unequivocal successes in our war against terror, the root causes of terrorism, particularly those driven by Islamic radicalism, remain very much with us. I noted during our last hearing that military operations alone will not win the longer war on terrorism, and this view was validated by testimony at the hearing. Even with an al-Qaeda organization that is scattered and on the run, its leadership continues to provide ideological guidance to followers worldwide. In other words, despite our operational and tactical successes on several fronts, the root causes of terrorism and the intense ideological motivation behind this phenomenon persist. We have started this inquiry from the premise that the United States anti-terrorism strategy cannot be reduced to military terms or to a fight against existing conspirators. It must include longer-term measures designed to prevent terrorist cells and movements that would target Americans on our shores and abroad from forming in the first place. In today's world, an anti-terrorist strategy cannot focus exclusively on capture and kill or on the derailment of imminent terrorist acts. Terrorism is a complex phenomenon that requires the application of technological, military, law enforcement, economic, diplomatic, and moral resources. To evaluate the United States anti-terrorism strategy, we have to know what causes a person to embrace an ideology that would have them resort to terrorism as a tactic. And once inclined towards such an ideology, what is it that would dissuade a person from committing violence toward Americans in the first place? Congressional oversight should ensure that we are getting the maximum benefit out of our anti-terrorism investments, that agencies are working cooperatively and effectively with one another, and that we are implementing a comprehensive strategy focused on achievable short and long-term objectives. And finally, we must know that how we can define our success in this effort and how we would know when we have achieved it. The purpose of today's hearing is to perform an examination of the historical roots of terrorism and how other nations have dealt with the phenomenon. We will focus in particular on the roots of Islamic-based terrorism, including the current image of the United States in the Muslim world, how Westerners and Muslims view each other, and the state of the struggle within contemporary Islam between its more moderate and extreme factions. We will also probe how the United States and its Western allies and counterparts can move toward a more productive, longer-term relationship with the Muslim world. Our panel today consists of 4 individuals who have unique experience to inform us on this complex and important topic. Dr. Bruce Hoffman is the corporate chair in Counterterrorism and Counterinsurgency at the RAND Corporation. He is also director of RAND's Washington office. He has a long history of scholarly writing on all aspects of terrorism and counterinsurgency and has worked as a senior advisor to many government entities in both the United States and Great Britain. He is the editor of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, the leading worldwide scholarly journal in the field, and has written extensively on al-Qaeda's tactics, strategies, and leadership. Mr. Andrew Kohut is the president of the Pew Research Center. He also acts as director of the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press and the Pew Global Attitudes Project. He was president of the Gallup organization from 1979 to 1989. Dr. Kohut is widely sought after as a commentator on public opinion. He's received many awards in his profession. He is the author of several books, the most recent of which is America Against the World: How We Are Different and Why We Are Disliked. Ambassador Akbar Ahmed is a respected scholar on contemporary Islam. He is a former High Commissioner of Pakistan to Great Britain and has advised many world leaders on Islam. He holds a chair in Islamic studies and is a professor of international relations at American University. The ambassador is also a distinguished anthropologist, writer, and filmmaker, and is the author of many books on Muslim history and society. He has just returned from an extensive trip throughout the Muslim world. Dr. Muqtedar Khan is professor of political science and international relations at the University of Delaware and a non-resident fellow at the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. He is known best for his insight relating to the role of moderate Muslims in Islamic thought. His thoughtful post-September 11 essay to his fellow American Muslims have been widely recognized and published. New York Newsday noted that Dr. Khan is one of a growing number of young moderate Muslim thinkers who believe themselves engaged in a battle for the soul of Islam. Gentlemen, we welcome you all. We appreciate your willingness to share your thoughts with us today. We look forward to your testimony. Let me mention that your statements will be made a part of the record in full, and you not ask for permission that this occur. And you may, as you choose, present your material, summarize it, or give extensively. We are here to hear you today, and then hopefully you will respond to our questions. I'd like to recognize the President, my distinguished colleague from California, Senator Barbara Boxer. Do you have a word of welcome for the witnesses?
I do, and I won't give an opening statement. I'm very anxious to hear from them, but I do welcome you. I think in light of events around the world right now, we need understanding, we need ideas, and we look to you for all of that and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Boxer. I'll ask you to testify in this order. First of all, Dr. Hoffman, and then Mr. Kohut, then Mr. Ahmed, and finally Dr. Khan. Would you please proceed, Dr. Hoffman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak before the committee today on this very important topic. In your opening remarks, you described al-Qaeda as an organization scattered and on the run. My testimony will argue that while that might even recently have been the case, today al-Qaeda has not only regrouped but is in fact on the march. Let me begin my oral testimony with two brief quotations in the recently cited report by the British Parliamentary Committee investigating the July 7, 2005 bombings in London. Quote, "We were working off a script which actually has been completely discounted from what we know as reality." That was by Andy Heyman, the Assistant Commissioner of Specialist Operations at Scotland Yard. In other words, Britain's top counterterrorism cop. Secondly, I think, quote, "I think the more we learned over this period of several years, the more we began to realize the limits of what we knew." This was by Tom Dowse, the chief of the UK Intelligence Assessment Staff. These two admissions, made by persons at the apex of the United Kingdom's counterterrorism effort, encapsulate the central challenge facing the United States today in our own counterterrorism effort. Given the threat's dynamic and evolutionary character and our adversaries' seeming ability to adapt and adjust their tactics and modi operandi to overcome or obviate even our most consequential countermeasures, how can we best ensure that our own assessments and analyses are anchored firmly to sound empirical judgment and not blinded by either conjecture, mirror imaging, politically partisan prisms, or wishful thinking? And equally critically, how can we ensure that our counterterrorism policy is sufficiently comprehensive, well-crafted, and effectively directed? Let me first begin with a brief description of al-Qaeda today, its evolution, adaptation, and adjustment. Al-Qaeda's obituary has been written often since 9/11. Today it is frequently spoken of as an organization in retreat, a broken and beaten movement, incapable of mounting further attacks on its own and instead having devolved operational authority either to its various affiliates and associates or to entirely organically produced homegrown terrorist entities. Nothing could be further from the truth. Al-Qaeda, in fact, is on the march. It is regrouped and reorganized from the setbacks meted out by the United States and our coalition partners and allies during the initial phases of the global war on terrorism, and is marshaling its forces to continue the epic struggle begun now 10 years ago this coming August. The Al-Qaeda of today combines, as it always has, both a bottom-up approach, encouraging independent thought and action from low or lower-level operatives, and a top-down one, with its remaining central command issuing orders and still coordinating a far-flung terrorist enterprise with both highly synchronized and autonomous moving parts. The most salient threat continues to come from Al-Qaeda Central and from its affiliates and associated terrorist groups. However, an additional and equally challenging threat is now posed by less discernible and more unpredictable entities drawn from the vast Muslim diaspora and community in Europe. This new category of terrorist adversary, moreover, also has proven more difficult for the authorities in these countries to track, predict, and anticipate. It is also difficult, if not impossible, to effectively profile this adversary. Indeed, this was precisely the conclusion reached by the above-mentioned parliamentary committee in their report on last year's London bombings. Although the members of these terrorist cells may be marginalized individuals working in menial jobs from the lower socioeconomic strata of society, some with long criminal records or histories of juvenile delinquency, others may well come from solidly middle and upper middle class backgrounds with university and perhaps even graduate degrees and prior passions for cars, sports, rock music, and other completely secular material interests. These new recruits are the anonymous cogs in the worldwide Al-Qaeda enterprise and include both long-standing residents and new immigrants found across Europe, but specifically in countries with large Muslim populations, such as Britain, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Let me now briefly turn to what I argue are the perils of wishful thinking, Al-Qaeda and the 7/7 London bombings. The United Kingdom, of course, rightly prides itself on decades-long experience and detailed knowledge of effectively countering a variety of terrorist threats. Yet, despite Britain's formidable counterterrorist capabilities and unrivaled expertise, its security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies, as the quotes at the beginning of this testimony evidence, dismiss the likelihood of an imminent attack in the United Kingdom, and moreover, believe that eventually, when such an attack would occur, it would not involve suicide tactics. The point of this discussion is most certainly not to criticize our principal ally in the war on terrorism, but rather to highlight the immense difficulties and vast uncertainties concerning countering terrorism today that have confounded even the enormously professional and experienced British intelligence and security services. Moreover, the danger of similarly cloaking ourselves in a false sense of security based on faulty assumptions or wishful thinking is omnipresent in so fluid and dynamic a terrorism environment as exists today. Indeed, our appreciation and understanding of the current Al-Qaeda threat underscores these perils. Both at the time of the London bombings and since, a misconception has frequently been perpetuated that this was entirely an organic or homegrown phenomena of self-radicalized, self-selected terrorists. Such arguments often were cited in support of the argument that entirely homegrown threats had superseded those posed by Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda itself was no longer a consequential active terrorist force, and accordingly, that the threat had both changed and perhaps even receded. The evidence that has come to light since the London attacks a year ago, however, points to the opposite conclusion, that Al-Qaeda is not only alive and kicking, but that it is still actively planning and supporting through the provision of training and perhaps even directing terrorist attacks on a global canvas. Issues of classification and sensitive collection prevent a full description and account of this evidence of active Al-Qaeda involvement in the London attacks. However, suffice it to say that what is publicly known and what has been reported in numerous unclassified sources clearly points to such involvement. Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, for instance, the ringleader of the London gang, visited Pakistan on at least 2 occasions, and on his second visit was accompanied by another London bomber, Shahzad Tanweer. It is believed that they visited Pakistani jihadi terrorist training camps and indeed that they met with al-Qaeda operatives. Both men made quote-unquote martyrdom videos while they were in Pakistan between November 2004 and February 2005. And like all of Osama bin Laden's most important videotaped statements and appearances, the Khan and Tanweer statements were both professionally produced and released by al-Qaeda's perennially active communications department, Ash Sahab for media production. Ash Sahab means the clouds. Finally, in concluding my testimony, how do we move towards a new U.S. counterterrorism policy given the changing and dynamic character of the terrorist threat today? This brief discussion of the 7/7 London bombings is intended to illustrate both the dynamic changing nature of a threat that cannot be defeated by military means alone. Yet our policy to date has arguably been predominantly weighted towards the tactical kill and capture approach and metric, assuming that a traditional center of gravity exists, whether the target is al-Qaeda or the insurgency in Iraq, and that this target simply needs to be destroyed so that global terrorism or the Iraqi insurgency will end. However, both our adversaries today and the threats that they pose are much more elusive and complicated, and as the previous discussion of the London attacks clearly depicts, less neatly amenable to kinetic solutions. Accordingly, a new strategy and a new approach is vital. Its success will be predicated upon a strategy that effectively combines the tactical elements of systematically destroying and weakening enemy capabilities, the kill-capture approach, alongside the equally critical, broader strategic imperative of breaking the cycle of terrorist recruitment and replenishment that have respectively sustained both al-Qaeda's continued campaign and the ongoing conflict in Iraq. A successful strategy will thus be one that also thinks and plans ahead, with a view towards addressing the threats likely to be posed by the terrorist and insurgent generation, not only beyond the current one, but beyond the one after the current one. At the foundation of such a dynamic and adaptive strategy must be the ineluctable maxim that effectively and successfully countering terrorism as well as insurgency is not exclusively a military endeavor, but involves fundamental parallel political, social, economic, and ideological activities. Accordingly, rather than viewing the fundamental organizing principle of American national defense strategy in this unconventional realm as a global war on terrorism, it may be more useful to reconceptualize it in terms of a global counterinsurgency. Such an approach would a priori knit together the equally critical political, economic, diplomatic, and developmental sides inherent to the successful prosecution of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency and contribute to the existing dominant military side of the equation. Greater attention to this integration of American capabilities would provide incontrovertible recognition of the importance of endowing a global counterinsurgency with an overriding and comprehensive multidimensional policy. Ideally, this policy would embrace several elements, including a clear strategy, a defined structure for implementing it, and a vision of intergovernmental agency cooperation and the unified effort to guide it. A more focused and strengthened interagency process would also facilitate the coordination of key themes and messages and the development and execution of long-term hearts and minds programs. The U.S. government, in sum, will need to adjust and adapt its strategy, resources, and tactics to formidable opponents that, as we have seen, are widely dispersed and decentralized and whose many destructive parts are autonomous, mobile, and themselves highly adaptive. In this respect, even the best strategy will be proven inadequate if military and civilian agency leaders are not prepared to engage successfully within ambiguous environments and to reorient their organizational culture to deal with irregular threats. A successful global counterinsurgency transcends the need for better tactical intelligence or new organizations. It is fundamentally about transforming the attitudes and mindsets of leaders so that they have the capacity to take decisive yet thoughtful action against terrorists and insurgents in uncertain or unclear situations based on a common vision, policy, and strategy. In sum, new times, new threats, and new challenges make a new strategy, approach, and new organizational and institutional behaviors necessary. The effectiveness of a U.S. strategy will be based on our capacity to think like a networked enemy in anticipation of how they may act in a variety of situations aided by different resources. This goal requires that the American national security structure, in turn, organize itself for maximum efficiency, information sharing, and the ability to function quickly and effectively under new operational definitions. With this understanding in mind, we need to craft an approach that specifically takes into account the following key factors to effectively wage a global counterinsurgency. One, separating the enemy from the populace that provides its support and sustenance. This, in turn, entails three basic missions: denial of enemy sanctuary, elimination of enemy freedom of movement, denial of enemy resources and support. Second, identification and neutralization of the enemy. Third, creation of a secure environment progressing from local to regional to global. Fourth, ongoing and effective neutralization of enemy propaganda and information operations through the planning and execution of a comprehensive and integrated information operations and holistic civil affairs campaign of our own. Finally, interagency efforts to build effective and responsible civil governance mechanisms that eliminate the fundamental causes of terrorism and insurgency. In conclusion, al-Qaeda may be compared to the archetypal shark in the water that must keep moving forward no matter how slowly or incrementally, or die. In al-Qaeda's context, this means adapting and adjusting to our countermeasures while simultaneously searching to identify new targets and new vulnerabilities. In this respect, al-Qaeda's capacity to continue to prosecute this struggle is a direct reflection of both the movement's resiliency and the continued resonance of its ideology. Al-Qaeda's operational durability thus has enormous significance for United States counterterrorism strategy and policy. Because al-Qaeda has this malleable resiliency, it cannot be defeated or destroyed in a single military engagement or even a series of engagements, much less ones exclusively dependent on the application of conventional forces and firepower. To a significant degree, our ability to carry out such missions effectively will depend on the ability of American strategy and policy to adjust and adapt to changes we see in the nature and character of our adversaries. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hoffman, for that remarkable paper and the insight you presented to our hearing. We call now on Dr. Andrew Kohut for his testimony.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to help the committee understand the attitudes of people in the Muslim world toward the West, toward the United States, toward the issues related to the war on terrorism. Since 2002, the Pew Global Attitudes Project, which I direct, has interviewed more than Since 2002, the Pew Global Attitudes Project, which I direct, has interviewed more than 110,000 people in 50 countries, many of them Arab countries or predominantly Muslim countries in Africa and in Asia. What I would like to do is to do two things today: to update you on trends toward the United States and the attitudes toward terrorism in Muslim countries, but also tell you about a new survey that we conducted this year, which was a broader investigation about how people in the Muslim world and how Westerners view each other on a personal and individual level, and I think it has great bearing on the work of this committee. First, the Global Attitudes Project has more generally documented the rise of anti-Americanism around the world since its inception in 2002. We have seen this to be especially the case in Muslim countries. Our most recent polls have found that the American people and the United States are viewed unfavorably in virtually all of the Muslim countries in which we have conducted surveys. This is even the case in countries that are closely allied with us. For example, in Turkey, just 12% of the people that we interviewed have a favorable view of the United States. Back in 2000, that was as high as as 50%. Similarly, in Jordan, 15% hold a positive view of us. In Pakistan, 27% hold a positive view of us. The numbers are not very good anywhere. Of all of the countries that we've interviewed in 2 years that are predominantly Muslim, only in Morocco have we seen close to a majority saying anything positive about the United States. And unlike in much of the rest of the world, the complaints aren't restricted just to the government, to the country writ large, but also to the American people who are held in low regard in the Muslim world. Anti-Americanism in the Muslim world is driven by the United States' policies. The war in Iraq, most recently, the war on terrorism generally, United States support for Israel probably most fully, and the general perception that the United States conducts its foreign policy unilaterally. I'd like to just give you a quick overview of the important trends that we've seen in the past 5 years. First of all, anti-Americanism existed before the war in Iraq in the Mideast and in Central Asia. But with the war in Iraq, it really intensified. But the biggest impact is that with the war in Iraq, anti-Americanism became a global phenomenon in the Muslim world. We saw anti-Americanism and dislike of the country and the people grow tremendously in Africa and in Asia, where previously that had not been the case, notably in Indonesia, notably in Nigeria. Secondly, the war on terrorism, while viewed with increasing suspicion among our European allies, has never been accepted in the Muslim world. It's seen as the U.S. picking on Muslim countries, as protecting Israel, and attempting to control the world. Thirdly, there's been substantial support for terrorism and terrorists among Muslim publics. Sizable minorities in many Muslim countries have said that suicide bombings that target civilians in defense of Islam is sometimes or often justifiable, and many significant numbers of people in many of these countries have expressed admiration and a positive view of Osama bin Laden. While these trends have been mostly negative, we have seen some positive signs too. The image of the United States improved markedly in Indonesia and somewhat even in Pakistan in response to the aid that we gave to victims of the natural disasters in those countries. We have seen support for terrorism decline somewhat in a number of countries, especially those who've had their own experience with it. In Morocco, Indonesia, Pakistan, and most recently, support for suicide bombing, or believing that suicide bombing is justifiable, decreased in the aftermath of attacks in those countries. But while there's less support for suicide bombing and a less favorable regard for bin Laden, support for terrorism has far from disappeared in the Muslim world. In the survey that we conducted this year, 29% of Jordanians and Egyptians see suicide bombing that targets civilians as justifiable. Finally, our polling has found Muslims consistently saying that Western-style democracy can work in their countries, and that's a good thing. And despite the fact that they can't say, it's very difficult for them to say good things about the United States, they do tell us that they think that the United States supports democracy in their country. These are among the broad general trends that we've found in the Muslim world and in the Mideast specifically. Now I want to turn to what we've learned about in our most recent survey about how Muslim publics and Western publics view each other. That was the focus of our research in the current polling. In the Muslim world, we did surveys in Indonesia, Pakistan, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, and also in Nigeria, the Muslim part of Nigeria, which is about 60% of that country. In the West, we polled the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Spain. But we also made a special effort to interview the Muslim minorities in the 4 European countries, Britain, France, Germany, and Spain. Our overall conclusion in this survey was that a real divide does exist between the people of both cultures. The one thing that the Muslims and the Western respondents agreed on is that relations aren't good. That was the view of 70% of Germans, 55% of Americans, but it was matched by 64% of Turks and 58% of Egyptians who agree that the West and the Muslim people are not getting along very well. When we probed the image of each people among the other, we saw very negative stereotyping. Westerners see Muslims as fanatical, violent, and not tolerant. Muslims see Westerners as selfish, immoral, greedy, as well as violent and fanatical. There's a lot of finger-pointing clearly going on in the way Westerners and Muslims look at each other. And last year's controversy over the cartoons of Muhammad in Europe really highlighted it. Muslims saw Western disrespect for the Islamic religion. Westerners saw the Muslims as intolerant and not respecting freedom of expression. There are also very competing views about women. Each culture says the other side is not respectful of the way women are treated in their world. Our second conclusion is that many Muslim publics have an aggrieved view of the West. Many blame U.S. and Western policies for the lack of prosperity in the Muslim world. Muslims feel more embittered toward the West and its people than vice versa. Muslim publics attribute more negative qualities to Western people than Westerners do to Muslims. They also rate Christians, and especially Jews, far less favorably than Europeans and Americans evaluate Muslim people. Most Muslims, one of the most shocking findings of this survey, at least to me, was that most Muslims remain unconvinced that a group of Arab men carried out the 9/11 attacks. In Indonesia, 65% said no, it didn't happen that way. In Jordan, 53% said it didn't happen that way. Even in Turkey, 59% said it didn't happen that way. This is the same question that the Gallup organization had asked in about January or February of 2002, right after the attacks, and basically we found the same answers that Gallup found. Most Muslim publics in denial about who carried out these attacks. On the other hand, while there is this aggrieved view in the Muslim world, Westerners are skeptical of Muslim values. Westerners, more often than Muslims, see a conflict between Islam and modernity. They don't think it works that well. Westerners are less optimistic about the prospects for democracy in the Muslim world than are Muslims themselves, who, as I said earlier, have consistently told us that they believe Western-style democracy will work there. This may reflect, the views of Westerners may reflect that Americans and Western Europeans are very dismayed about the Hamas election victory in Palestine, but certainly Muslim publics are not. They see it as good for the Palestinian people. They see it good for the resolution of the conflict with Israel. Westerners also see more support for Al-Qaeda in the Muslim world than do Muslims. This poll has a lot of negative findings. We did find some positive things. First of all, there's not, following a bad year of riots and the 7/7 bombings, we didn't see an outright spike in hostility between Muslims and Westerners. The attitudes that I'm speaking about are of a more long-lasting, enduring nature. Majorities in France, Britain, and the U.S. retain generally favorable views of Muslims. And, as I said earlier, there's been another decline in support for suicide bombing in a number of countries. But there still remains considerable support. Sizable majorities in major Muslim countries say suicide bombing can be justified, even among Europe's moderate Muslims, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. 1 in 7 feel suicide bombings that target civilians can be justified under certain circumstances in defense of Islam. I have to tell you, though, that the most troubling numbers are the ones that we got out of Nigeria. In Nigeria, 61% of the people that we interviewed, the Muslims that we interviewed, said they had a favorable view of Osama bin Laden, and 56% say most of the people that they know have a support radical groups like Al-Qaeda. We haven't gone back into Africa in any great detail since 2002. I did note the change in opinion. When we do go back, we can only hope that what we've found in Nigeria isn't echoed in among other Muslim publics. With regard to the European Muslims, they hold a more temperate view of the West than do Muslims in the Mideast and Asia and Africa. European Muslims have more positive views of Westerners than those in the countries back home. They are less likely than other Europeans to see a conflict between modernity and Islam. They think it can work. Most European Muslims express favorable opinions of Christians and more favorable opinions of Jews than do Muslims in other countries. In France in particular, there are relatively positive views among French Muslims of Jews. Muslims in Europe do worry about their future, but their concern is more economic than religious or cultural. Generally, European Muslims show signs of favoring a moderate version of Islam. One of the things I'd like to emphasize, if you look at our study carefully, there is no clear European point of view about Muslims. There is not a clear European Muslim point of view. The views of French, German, Spanish, and British Muslims are quite distinct. British Muslims are the most anxious about their future. They're the most concerned about extremism, but they have the largest minority expressing very antagonistic views toward Westerners. French Muslims are the most integrated, eager to be part of the French society, and most welcomed by the general public. German Muslims are the most likely to consider Europeans hostile, and the German public is least accepting of Muslim immigrants of the four publics that we've questioned. I'd like to conclude that it's no secret that the United States has an image problem in the Muslim world. Iraq has intensified it and broadened discontent with America and its people among Muslims in the Mideast, Africa, and Asia. There's little sign in our surveys that this has meaningfully changed over the past 3 years. In some predominantly Muslim countries, things have gotten better. In other countries, things have gotten a little worse. But the bottom line remains the same. We are poorly regarded by most Muslim people, and significant numbers of them express at least tacit support for terrorist tactics and the enemies of the United States, although the trends have been going in the right direction on these measures. As the events of the past year in Europe have indicated, there is a broad divide between Westerners and Muslims around the world. Misunderstanding, value differences, economic-based resentment have led to suspicion and a mutually acknowledged divide or clash of civilizations. The good news is that Muslims in Europe are nonetheless far more moderate and positive toward the West than Muslims living in the Mideast, Africa, and Asia. Their attitudes and the attitudes of the general population in the host countries suggest that exposure might indeed lead to improved understanding, mostly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kohut. We'd like to hear now from Mr. Ahmed, if you would proceed.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be speaking to this committee. I'm especially thankful to Chairman Lugar for inviting me. I have been arguing since 9/11 that terrorism, the war on terror, cannot be understood without looking at the big picture, and this is what I'll do this morning. Terrorism is one small piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and that has been the limitation of the strategy thus far. Let us remind ourselves why this session, relations between the United States and the Muslim world, is so important. Islam is a world civilization of 1.4 billion people and growing, 57 states, one of which is nuclear for the time being, and there are some 7 million Muslims living in the United States. Besides, the United States has troops fighting and losing lives in 2 Muslim nations, Iraq and Afghanistan. Neither the war on terror nor a serious tackling of the global crises facing all of us on this planet, crises like global warming, poverty, the population explosion, the religious and ethnic conflicts, none of these can be resolved unless the vast and highly significant world of Islam is brought into a mutually respectful partnership with the rest of the world, especially with the United States, the sole superpower and leader of the world. As a Muslim scholar living in Washington, D.C., I felt on 9/11 that I had to do whatever little I could to create understanding between the two. I also knew that my extensive field experiences in charge of some of the most inaccessible areas of the Muslim world, such as South Waziristan Agency, where Osama bin Laden is supposed to be hiding, would be an added advantage. This urge took me on travels in the Muslim world to 9 countries in the 3 major regions of the Muslim world: the Middle East, South Asia, and Far East Asia from February to April 2006. I was accompanied by a small but enthusiastic group of American research assistants. We were able to discuss these issues with a whole range of people, from President Musharraf to prime ministers, princes, sheikhs, professors, students, taxi drivers, the whole gamut of society. We visited mosques, madrasas, university campuses, and classrooms. And the project was sponsored by 3 leading institutions in Washington: American University, the Brookings Institution, and the Pew Forum. Now, at the conclusion of the trip, my team and I felt that there was bad news and there was good news. So, the bad news first. Throughout the travels, we encountered very high levels of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. I have never encountered such intensity of emotion. The Muslim world in the years of the Cold War, when the United States was so obviously the moral power, admired and respected the United States. Today we found that many Muslims do not see the United States as the moral power it once used to be. In fact, many of the people we surveyed throughout the 9 countries said that they would prefer Saddam Hussein, the most ruthless and vile of dictators, to the Americans in Iraq. In Turkey, the most popular film ever made is called Valley of the Wolves, Iraq. It's in theaters everywhere, and it is a crudely anti-American film which shows a group of Rambo Turkish soldiers fighting against the evil United States soldiers. Even in the moderate country of Indonesia, and I have bad news for my colleague who referred to Nigeria and hoped that Osama bin Laden would only be restricted as a role model there, on university campuses we found that bin Laden was the #1 role model. He is now referred to Sheikh Osama bin Laden. That is bad news. Perhaps you don't understand the nuance, but for a Muslim like me, it is bad news. Anyone trying to preach and promote moderation will find this a major hurdle, because Sheikh means he's been elevated to a religious status. The Muslim world focuses on action rather than rhetoric, and right now they're seeing cold-blooded rapes in Iraq by United States soldiers, the encouragement of torture, and they feel they're not seeing the ideals of the United States of democracy, human rights, and acceptance of diversity that it once so proudly and clearly stood for. One affluent woman who used to live in the United States even told my team that she was scared to bring her grandchildren back to the United States because of the way they treat Muslims. That is the bad news. Furthermore, there is a widespread perception in the Muslim world that Islam is under attack from the United States. As we saw with the Danish cartoon controversy and the desecration of the Quran story, Muslims all over the world are very passionate about their religion and their prophet. It is a culture with high reverence for and sensitivity to these religious symbols and traditions. Now let me explain what's going on in the Muslim world. There is a common belief here in the West that all this begins on 9/11. In fact, the story goes back almost 2 centuries. There has been a struggle within Islam, not so much for the soul of Islam, but for the politics and the culture and society of Islam, between 3 broad interpretations of Islam, between an orthodox literalist interpretation, between one that advocates synthesis and receptivity to the West, and thirdly, the universalist or mystic response to the world. 3 defined but distinct responses. So some of the labels that we are seeing after 9/11 cause nothing but confusion. And if you get your labeling wrong, you're going to run into problems later on, because all your strategy is going to be wrong. Right now, the warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, the perceived attacks on Islam, and the insensitivity to culture are all reinforcing the strong, orthodox, literalist interpretation of Islam. And this is now spreading throughout the Muslim world. So remember the formula. The more you push the Muslim world, the greater the support for the literalist orthodox. The more you marginalize the moderates, the more you wipe out the mystics and the humanists. This is the simple formula we need to appreciate. There's cause and effect here. I refer to anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism, but would like to introduce another word related, perhaps not directly, but related in the concept of hatred, which is Islamophobia, the hatred of all things Islamic. Although these concepts are different, but Islamophobia after 9/11 has gained momentum. The reasons are obvious. The 19 hijackers on 9/11 are all Muslim. Some of the most wanted people on the planet, Osama bin Laden and so on, are Muslim. So people generally and too easily equate Muslims to terrorists and extremists. The result of this Islamophobia has been attacks on Islam and on Muslims. Muslims then find there is little hope of getting justice in this climate and are sometimes pushed towards acts of violence. I do not wish to condone these acts by any means and have condemned them, but I want to put the discussion in some context. Now for the good news. This ignorance and hatred can be challenged and can change. Just as Muslims are sensitive to attacks on Islam, Muslims are also very receptive to the positive messages from within Islam. I encourage Chairman Lugar, you and your colleagues, and indeed the American people, to learn about Islam and find the common bonds between the two civilizations. Indeed, American values of equality, justice, knowledge and compassion, as seen in the respect for human rights, are shared explicitly with Islam. Remind the leaders in the Muslim world and the people there of these common values without giving lectures to them. Remind them of the context. Remind them that beheadings, suicide bombings are not part of Islam, and that two of the greatest attributes of God in Islam are the merciful and the compassionate. These two words are repeated by Muslims throughout the day, all over the planet. Speaking about the common values shared by the founding fathers of the United States and the ideals of Islam will make a powerful and long-lasting impact on the hearts and minds of Muslims. Furthermore, Muslims, Christians and Jews share deep bonds between them. Muslims are asked in the Quran to recognize the Jews and the Christians as people of the book, and they hold a special place in our theology. A common figure who inspires us and who we share as a common patriarch and ancestor is Abraham. And as for the love of Jesus in Islam, I urge you to read the Jesus poems of Rumi, who is such a popular poet in the United States. We share the notion of an omnipotent universal God, the 10 Commandments, many of the central values. While political and historical events have divided the two, the examples of peaceful coexistence also exist. So during these travels in the Muslim world, I would use these ideas. And I believe that the first most important step was to talk about dialogue, understanding and friendship. So dialogue number 1, understanding number 2, friendship number 3. You cannot have simple dialogue and leave it there. One of the ways I would deal with the anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism was to talk of the dialogues I am having and the friendships that have been created here in Washington, D.C. I mentioned my friends like Jean and Steve Case, Ambassador Doug and Ann Holliday, Bishop John and Karen Chain, Senior Rabbi Bruce Lustig and his wife Amy, and Dr. Lachlan Reed, and many other friends like this. In my travels, I mentioned these wonderful Americans who became my friends and who reached out to me after 9/11, seeing a lonely stranger in their midst. I mentioned how I am personally inspired by the example of my friend Judea Pearl, who lost his only son Danny Pearl in a brutal, savage and senseless killing in Karachi. Having got to know Judea as a friend over the years because of our dialogues conducted nationally and internationally in promoting Jewish-Muslim understanding, I have seen the heroic transformation of a personal tragedy into building a bridge to reach out and understand the very civilization that produced the killers who took his son's life. I would point out that these friendships have also helped to transform the relationship between Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the United States. And please keep the context in mind. I was quoting these names in a mosque in Damascus, where I was asked to deliver the post-sermon talk on a Friday, very significant for Muslims, in madrasas in Deoband, in Delhi, in speeches in Islamabad, at the Royal Institute in Amman. I would finally ask my team of young Americans to speak, and I would introduce them as the best ambassadors we have between the United States and the Muslim world, as intrepid Americans who represented the best ideals of America. And for commentary on our travels, please see beliefnet.com for articles by Dilshad Ali and the young Americans who accompanied me, Haley Walt and Jonathan Hayden. And I'm grateful, Chairman Lugar, for giving me permission to bring them here. They're here with me this morning. As a professor on campus, I would also recommend some books, and this is what I would urge for you to do. This is an instinct, I suspect, a genetic instinct in all professors. We can't restrain from doing this. My first book is by my friend, Dr. Jonathan Sacks, the Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, and it is called The Dignity of Difference. It is a powerful plea for Abrahamic understanding in the age of globalization. The second book I would recommend to my Muslim audiences and to my American audience this morning is also by a friend, Karen Armstrong, and her book is The Battle for God. In this book, Karen illustrates how the three different faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all going through a period of intense internal debate in what she calls the fundamentalist mode. And thirdly, to keep a balance, we've got a Jewish, Christian, Muslim author. I would recommend my own book, Islam Under Siege, which argues that we are living in a world in which societies are feeling under siege, whether American societies, Israeli societies, or Muslim societies. And when societies feel under siege, they tend to be defensive, and there is limited scope for wisdom or compassion. Essentially, this boils down to one recommendation. And perhaps you may dismiss it as too idealistic, but that is the only way to make lasting peace for the United States and the Muslim world. It is to create bonds of friendship across religion, race, and tradition. I have discovered in a very personal sense, not only as a scholar on campus, but as someone involved in a very realistic, pragmatic way in dealing with real-life situations, that once friendship develops, everything can change. Without these friendships, dialogue itself remains a restricted exchange of ideas and leads to little else. This suggestion may be unlikely, particularly with the growing situation in the Middle East. But without genuine friendships, we cannot expect any major changes in how we are dealing with the political situations on the ground. Take the example of the Palestinians and the Israelis. Too often the two view each other as enemies and are not prepared to concede anything except in terms of an advantage to themselves. The result is that even if there are concessions, they are seen to be a result of bitter negotiations which continue to leave acrimony on both sides. But if both parties are able to create friendships and then meet as friends, the situation will be very different, and the peace process itself may take a new momentum and a new meaning. In conclusion, this is a great leap of imagination I'm asking you to make. But the exercise to understand the Muslim world is not a luxury for the United States. It is an absolute imperative. It is the first step allowing you to confront the looming series of world crises which we face in the 21st century. And as you on the panel are those who this great nation looks to for wisdom and guidance, I plead with you this morning to set aside the partisan and parochial issues and focus on the challenges of providing justice, compassion, and friendship in this dangerous, uncertain, and violent time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mr. Ahmed. And now we call upon Dr. Khan for his testimony.
In the name of God, most merciful and most benevolent, distinguished Chairman Senator Lugar and Senator Boxer, it is indeed an honor to share my expertise with this august body. As I was sitting here, I was thinking of an important Islamic ritual called Shura. And I think we practice shura with great nobility and distinction here in the U.S. than in any Muslim society, unfortunately. Shura means the process of consultation and deliberation. Islam is structurally a dynamic religion that is epistemologically pluralistic from the very beginning. What I mean by structurally dynamic is in that it has internal mechanisms which allow it to be continuously evolving, to be reinterpreted. And as a result of this internal dynamic structure, Islam continues to remain relevant to Muslim life regardless of time and place. It is not a coincidence or an accident that Islam is more meaningful to Muslims, whether they live in the West or whether they live in the East, than other religions in other societies. But what is also interesting about Islam is its internal pluralism. From the very beginning, there have been many interpretations of Islam. It is safe to say that there have been many Islams. There has been the Shia and Sunni, rational, traditional, mystical, philosophical, cultural, and juristic. So in the last 1400 years, we have seen several interpretations of Islam. They have coexisted across time and space. Lately, for the purposes of U.S. foreign policy, since 9/11, we have been trying to imagine a specific interpretation of Islam as perhaps the designated enemy. Conservative Americans, particularly, and Israelis, try to believe that there is a discrete ideological and institutionalized actor called radical Islam, and the sometimes radical fundamentalist Islam, that is essentially the problem. I submit to you that it is a mistake to assume that this is a discrete and coherent entity. For example, increasingly in the last few days, as the Lebanon crisis has precipitated, people have equated Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda as representatives of the same phenomenon. Al-Qaeda and Hamas are Sunni organizations. Hezbollah is a Shia organization. Hamas is very close to Islamic Brotherhood in its theology and its ideology, whereas Zawahiri, the number 2 person of Al-Qaeda, has written books chastising the Muslim Brotherhood. There is enormous enmity between the Muslim Brotherhood and the jihadis, and therefore there is no sympathy that Al-Qaeda has for Hamas. That is why until now we have not seen Al-Qaeda target Israel. What is also interesting is that we have never seen Hamas target the United States. So it's very important for us to not club everything under the rubric of radical Islam. But that does not mean that there is no such tendency of radical Islam. There are many manifestations of Islam today, but for the purposes of American foreign policy, it is important to recognize that there is, yes, a very vicious, a very violent, very intolerant interpretation which is out there. But in order to understand that, I submit to you that it is better to look at these various manifestations of Islam in the Muslim world as options. Today, there is a near universal consensus in the Muslim world on 3 issues. Number 1, that there must be political, social, normative, cultural, economic, and structural change. Nobody wants the Muslim world to remain as it is. Everybody wants change. Muslims are struggling to respond to these challenges of modernity and postmodernity, to the challenges of globalization, and particularly to the challenges, the structural challenges that have emerged as a result of the decolonization process. Number 2, most Muslims agree that there is no security in Muslim societies. They are victims of terrorism and war. As I heard President Bush repeatedly repeat that Israel has a right to defend itself, I kept amazingly wondering as to how nobody has ever said that even the Lebanese have a right to defend themselves. Muslim insecurity is taken for granted. There is also a strong consensus that Islam must play a role in the resurgence, reconstitution, revival of the Muslim world, and therefore you see many different options. The point I'm trying to make is this, that Muslims are trying through many ways to cope with modernization and globalization. Radical Islam is one option, and it is not an ideological issue. If moderate Muslims cannot deliver, then Muslims will abandon that option and seek another option. if our moderate allies in the Middle East will not provide Muslim security, dignity, respect, and freedom, then they will turn to the next option. So the United States, when it chooses partners, it is not important to choose partners on the basis of what they say or what they believe, but it is important for us to actually shape the outcomes on the ground in the Muslim world. There is, however, an alternative interpretation of Islam, which is a direct challenger of radical Islam. We sometimes call it moderate Islam, or sometimes we call it liberal Islam. Liberal Islam has 3 or 4 important strategic merits for the United States and the West, and I will list them for you. Number 1, liberal Islam is providing an alternative understanding of world political and global realities in order to prevent the perception that war on terror is a war on Islam. Number 2, liberal Muslims have an interpretation of Islam which privileges ijtihad over jihad. Ijtihad is an intellectual exercise for reviving society. They privilege education and development over violence and conflict. Number 3, the liberal interpretation of Islam advances an idiom that explains the compatibility of liberal values such as tolerance, democracy, and pluralism. Finally, liberal Islam deconstructs the jihadi discourse to expose the extremist tendencies behind their interpretation of Islam and underscores the more compassionate and rational dimensions of Islam. It is important for us to understand who is a moderate Muslim. One of the jokes in the Muslim world is that all moderate Muslims have been Karzai'd, in the sense that they have become like Ahmed Karzai, or the president of Afghanistan, who has no respect in his own people. And this is very important for us. When we work with moderate Muslims, we ensure that we do not undermine their own legitimacy in the very constituency that they seek to reform and address. I would also like to talk to you about American Muslims. The 9/11 Commission, to a great extent, exonerated the American Muslims of any direct involvement in the attacks of September 11th. American Muslims are very unique because they are very rich. In terms of per capita income, perhaps the richest Muslim community in the world. They are also the highest literacy levels. The American Muslim community, in my opinion, manifests more of liberal Islamic values and has institutionalized them than any other community anywhere in the rest of the Muslim world. As a result of that, the American Muslim community becomes a natural ally of the United States. What role can American Muslims play in this war on terror? American Muslims have enormous potential to become an important ally in America's war against extremism. They can discuss threat assessments and threat identification. This is a role that we can play to a great deal. American Muslims would have provided the administration with more accurate picture of the potential for threats from within the U.S. and outside. It is possible that American government is unnecessarily spending vast amounts of resources in surveillance of groups and individuals who may not constitute a threat and may actually be overlooking those who could be problematic. American Muslim input on this subject can be immensely useful. Many U.S. policymakers continue to err in understanding and predicting the behavior of Muslim groups, and the chaos in Iraq is a case in point. One interesting distinction that I would like to make is that the confusion over Hizb ut-Tahrir and Al-Qaeda. For the last 2 years, I've been watching experts in Washington, D.C. attribute Al-Qaeda's tactics to Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is essentially a non-violent organization, and attribute Hizb ut-Tahrir's ideology to Al-Qaeda, thereby committing gross errors. These are things that American Muslim scholars who have studied these movements can help the administration in understanding. American Muslims can provide a Muslim face to American foreign policy. And the administration has already realized the enormous benefits of having somebody like Zalmay Khalilzad as ambassador to Afghanistan and then as ambassador to Iraq, but only one. I once confronted Ambassador Karen Hughes and asked her to name the Muslims in her department, and she said there are 22, but she could not name one. That means they were not sufficiently high up for her to be consulting them for policy making. It is important that American Muslims be part of this administration. The Bush administration could have appointed a number of prominent American Muslim sportsmen who have respect worldwide, such as Hakeem Olajuwon, and even imams of local indigenous imams like Hamza Yusuf to become spokespersons for America and American Muslims. Another area in which American Muslims can provide assistance is on human intelligence and also in undercover operations. The recent operation in Canada, which arrested 18, was essentially because of the work of a moderate Canadian Muslim called Mubin Sheikh. And finally, American Muslims can play an important role in countering the radical Islamic discourse. One important arena where the U.S. needs its Muslim citizens is countering the anti-U.S. propaganda. Both Islamists and governmental media have launched a propaganda war against the U.S. in response to its war on terror. This anti-U.S. media offensive is determined to focus on U.S. foreign policy excesses and failures. The enormous success of Islam and Muslims within American borders is an asset to America. It is a wonderful story that needs to be told. The very fact that American Muslims are thriving in America is proof positive that America is not against Islam. If America was waging war against Islam, then Muslims in America would have been its first victims. This is an important message which we need. Finally, I think American Muslims can restore balance to America's foreign policy. To put it bluntly, American foreign policy in the contemporary era has been a colossal failure, and I think even a potential danger to America's security interests. This administration would do well to listen to some moderate Muslim voices in shaping its foreign policy. And finally, I want to address what the U.S. can do. The United States must deliberate seriously on what kind of relations it wishes to have with the religion, whose adherents constitute nearly 25% of the world population and include over 55 countries. Islam is also the fastest growing religion in all sectors of the West, in the US, in Canada, in Europe, and Australia. Islam is outside and Islam is inside. The United States and the West must find a way to coexist with Islam without constantly demanding Muslims to abandon Islam. This is a very important issue for Muslims since many see the United States as waging a war against Islam. This has to be done at every level, including government, media, and education. One statement by the President saying that Islam is a peaceful religion is not enough. It has to be repeated often, again and again. The United States must not undermine the important goal of maintaining positive U.S.-Muslim relations for short-term goals or for immediate expediency. The U.S. must improve its credibility. It must practice what it preaches, fulfill its promises, and certainly abstain from betraying those who take risks at our behest. If you look at the situation in Lebanon today, the way we have abandoned Lebanon, I'm not very sure if in the near future any moderate Muslim will be able to trust the United States and take risks for democracy at the behest of the United States. Muslims in Lebanon and Christians in Lebanon believe that the U.S., after marching them down the path towards democracy, has betrayed them. American Muslims are America's natural allies and the best community when it comes to institutionalization of liberal values. The U.S. must embrace it and treat it as an asset rather than as a suspect. The U.S. has to make goodwill gestures towards the Muslim world, and that does not mean supporting dictators or selling more arms. Cooperation. 1 minute. Cooperation in areas of development, education, and economic empowerment will go a long way. Even-handedness in its approach to the Muslim world is absolutely necessary. Abandoning it, especially in moments of crisis, is extremely detrimental. The U.S. must also rethink its relations with Islamists and find ways and means to work with the more moderate Islamists who are pro-democracy in order to empower them and to isolate the radicals. The U.S. must find a way to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict that does not undo years of diplomacy and good work on the U.S.-Islamic relations every time there is a crisis over Israel. Muslims think that the U.S. and the West does not value Muslim life and that we do not care for their human rights. The changing of this perception will take a long time, but the United States can begin with Guantanamo, and by recognizing that Muslims too have a right to defend their lives, their property, their territory, and their sovereignty. U.S. foreign policy since 9/11 has sought security for America and its ally Israel by deliberately undermining the security of the Muslim world through bellicose rhetoric, irresponsible aggressions, and astonishing disregard for Muslim life. We must realize that we cannot be more secure by making others feel insecure. There needs to be a paradigm shift in how we think of security. We live in a highly globalized and interdependent world. Islam is outside, Islam is inside. It is important that we think of security for all, including Muslim nations, Muslim societies. This is imperative. I leave you with this comment. The United States and Muslim relations will remain a critical component of global politics for a long time. They must be repaired and nurtured. There is no other alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Let me say we really appreciate the comprehensive testimony of all four of you, and I know that Senator Boxer and I both have a number of questions. I'd like to call upon Senator Boxer, first of all, in case he has a time requirement, if you proceed.
Thank you. I do, and I so appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I found all of you very interesting, and I want to make a few comments here and ask a few questions. And how much time would I have?
We'll take the time that you require.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll try to keep it succinct. First of all, I want to say, Dr. Khan, I really liked your idea of having Muslim Americans play a larger role in our foreign policy, especially these days. It just makes eminent sense. And I think we all need to pay attention to that. And the beauty of our country is that we're so diverse. And you're right. You know, the American dream is there for everyone. That's why we're here, to make sure that stays that way. And everyone who has had the opportunity, I think, could be a great voice for our country. So that I really like. The place I really disagree with you is your comment about how America has abandoned Lebanon. And I know this is a very hot topic right now, but I feel I must say that as I look at the situation, it isn't America who has abandoned Lebanon, but in fact, it is, Syria and Hezbollah, and the fact that that the Lebanese don't have the ability, the wherewithal to police their own southern border. This is a crisis of major proportion, and if everyone paid attention to UN Resolution 1559, and Lebanon could in fact be free of this militia on the south and free of foreign influence, the world would be a far safer place. Now, I know this is a hot topic. I'm not going to get in an argument with you, but I don't believe in any way that America has abandoned Lebanon. Now, the one way I think America could have done better all these years is to pay more attention to that whole situation, to be pushing so that, in fact, UN Resolution 1559 was listened to, and to play a bigger role in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. For sure, I agree on that, but I don't think in this case you can point to America as the culprit for what is happening there. And I want to say to His Excellency Ahmed that I so appreciate your insights on religion. For myself, in my youth, I will never forget this, because when you're a child and your parents are everything to you. My parents bought me a book. It was called One God, and I never forgot it because it was so interesting to me. Because the point of the book, is written for children, was that in essence, regardless of what religion we follow, there's one God at the end of the day, and that very simple point really unites all people. And I think that, unfortunately, what has happened with religions, with organized religion over the years, is instead of instead of all of us working on that concept, somehow the differences have come to the fore. And that's a way bigger question than we have time to go into. But I really think that simple message has to get to children and get to all of us, because it will, in fact, bring us together. I need to get a few things, off my mind here when I listen to Mr. Kohut and his exceptional work out in the field. He's a bearer of bad news. He doesn't relish telling us this news, but the fact is that the opinion of this country in the world, frankly, if you even look beyond the Middle East, but in the Middle East, is dismal, and I think it is making us less safe. Anti-Americanism, to quote you, Mr. Kohut, is a global phenomenon, and this news is a blow to the American people. When I remember back again, we all bring our own experience to the table here when we were so beloved in the world, and rightly so. I mean, we had a clear sense of what we were about and what our role was in the world, and I think we've lost our way and made a lot of mistakes, and rage toward America makes us less safe, and anger makes us less safe. I personally believe that, you take President Bush's urge for democracy and elections, but you couple it with this anger, and what you get is, Hamas winning in the Palestinian territories, and Ahmadinejad being elected in Iran, and even in Iraq, the Bush administration favorites lost, and one didn't even get any votes, and in other regions of the world, the same thing is happening, sadly, in our own hemisphere. So while democracy as a goal is laudable, we've got a lot of homework to do to make sure that we are seen as a success and a beautiful model of what the world should all be like, and it's just not happening out there. And I want to talk about why I think that's so, and I don't want to be simplistic about it, because it's not simple. Just listening to you, Dr. Hoffman, I mean, it's complicated. But I think after 9/11, we had the whole world with us, Mr. Chairman. You remember, the whole world. In France, the headline was, "We are all Americans." And we blew it. By going into Iraq, there wasn't one al-Qaeda cell there on 9/11. I have shown this booklet on many occasions, as has Senator Feingold. This is a State Department document that came out right after 9/11, showed where al-Qaeda was, not in Iraq. No way, not one cell in Iraq. But instead of going after Osama bin Laden, who attacked us, keeping it clear, keeping the world together, going after terrorism, we turn around on a dime and we go into a place where our own State Department said there wasn't one al-Qaeda cell. And the president still says Iraq is part of the war on terror, and he said it at the time. And, the fact is, the terrorists moved in there after we went in there, because we became a real fuel for the insurgency. We are sitting ducks. We're losing some of the stories. I read today that yesterday we lost another 5 Americans, Mr. Chairman. I've lost about 23 to 25% of the people there of our military, either from California or based in California. It's extremely painful. I think the war in Iraq is a gift to Osama bin Laden, and it's a gift that keeps on giving. Every day that we are there, it's fueling the recruitment of terror groups. The more we get bogged down, and as I said, now al-Qaeda in Iraq is there, and they're responsible for 10% of the violence there, the most heinous violence. So I have a question here about a comment by Peter Bergen, and I'm going to address it to Dr. Hoffman. Peter Bergen, as you all know, I think most of you know, he's an expert on terrorism. He said, "What we've done in Iraq is what bin Laden could not have hoped for in his wildest dreams." This is all his quote. We invaded an oil-rich Muslim nation in the heart of the Middle East, the very type of imperial adventure bin Laden has long predicted was the United States' long-term goal in the region. Dr. Hoffman, do you agree with Peter Bergen that the war in Iraq played right into the hands of Osama bin Laden and those who are twisting the Muslim religion to benefit the war on terror?
Yes, I do. Certainly in bin Laden's seminal fatwa, which I referred to in my testimony that was issued in August 1996, in fact, in the last pages, he predicted that the United States and the United Kingdom would use Saudi Arabia as a base to wage a predatory and aggressive campaign against Islam with the intention of taking over the Muslims' most precious natural resource, the oil in the region. So in some respect, he was queuing this up long before it occurred. The reason, though, I agree with Peter is that there was an enormous change in al-Qaeda's propaganda in February and early March 2003, where the more ideological statements that appeared on alnidad.com, its principal internet organ then, were replaced by actual clarion calls to battle, calling upon jihadis to converge on Iraq to resist this latest instance of Western aggression, not to prop up Saddam Hussein, but rather to use this as an opportunity, I think an opportunity that they had lost because of their defeat in Afghanistan, to confront U.S. forces and to use suicide terrorist tactics and other means. So certainly I think it did play into his hands that this was one of the battlefields that he sought to create. Mm-hmm. By the same token, though, I think today we're in an enormously difficult situation where immediate withdrawal is not a solution, because this would indeed also play into his hands in the sense that this would be trumpeted, much like the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan in 1989 as yet another victory for the jihadi terrorists, and indeed perhaps even add more fuel to the fire in their aggressive intentions.
Well, you have said it well. The worst leadership, you didn't say this, to me, the worst leadership is when you have no good choices. You know, as a mom, I always learned from the child psychologist that you give your kids 3 good choices before, you say, you can either go to bed at 8:15 or 8:30. And, they're all good choices. Well, we don't have a good choice. Either we leave and cut our losses, or we stay, continue our losses because we're not sure what's going to happen. It could be used as a propaganda and the rest. That's a debate that we're having here every single day and every single minute, really, within the parties and across party lines. But to me, the fact is you never can forget why you're in this situation if you're going to be able to have better policies in the future. I have one last question, if I might. You've been so kind and generous, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. Again, on the dilemma that you pose, get out or stay. I was thinking the other day, if each of us picture ourselves in a room with a swarm of bees, and the door is shut, and we're in the room, and we have insecticide to spray that doesn't work too well, but it helps a little bit. We have a newspaper to swat, and then we have the door we could open and get out. And I think that reminds me of where we are. However, I do think closing the door is the best option. You could figure out how to deal with the situation once you're safely out of the room. But again, I'm not asking about that because you fortunately don't have to vote on those kind of issues. I do. And you don't have to write the letters that I write every day. Every day. The condolences. So that's where we are. So I want to go back to public opinion, Mr. Kohut. You found in a global opinion poll released last month that favorable views of the U.S. continue to drop throughout the world. According to your report, quote, America's global image has again slipped and support for the war on terror has declined even among close U.S. allies like Japan. The war in Iraq is a continuing drag on opinions of the U.S., not only in predominantly Muslim countries, but in Europe and in Asia as well. I want to ask you first, do you think, you mentioned the war in Iraq, if you were to, I know it's hard for you to do this, put a percentage as to how much of a role the war in Iraq has played in that opinion, and do you think, while you're thinking about this, also, do the people in the world know that Americans don't really agree with this administration on Iraq? Because in March, the Pew Research Center conducted a poll of Americans in which respondents were asked to give a one-word impression of the situation in Iraq. This is in our own country. According to the poll, the words mess, bad, chaos, terrible, and disaster were offered most frequently, along with such variants as hopeless, pitiful, Vietnam, and out of control. So do you think the people throughout the world are distinguishing between the American government's policy in Iraq and the American people in their views? Hard questions, I know.
Well, I think that probably in the Muslim world that distinction is not being made. There's more convergence between anti-Americanism toward the government and not liking the American people in the Muslim world than elsewhere. Perhaps in Europe there's a greater sense, or among our allies more generally, there's a greater sense that there's discontent with the war, although attitudes toward the war in the United States, as you well know, remain highly partisan. There's not discontent with the war among Republicans. It's mostly among Democrats and independents. So I think the answer is a mixed one to your second question. As to your first question, I would say give you the two headlines. In 2002, before the war in Iraq, our headline was that there's growing dislike of the U.S. around the world and discontent with the U.S., but there's still a reserve of goodwill toward the U.S. all around the world, outside of the Muslim world. Our headline in May of 2003, when things were really going pretty well in Iraq, was that the U.S. image has plummeted all around the world. And it pretty much hasn't recovered. There have been some ups and downs. A lot of what we were writing about this year was the fact that the progress we had seen in some places last year had slipped back, in Indonesia and India and Russia, for example. But, the war in Iraq is the 800-pound gorilla with respect to the image of the United States around the world. But perceptions of America's policies with respect to Israel and Palestine, the Israeli-Palestine dispute is the 800-pound gorilla in that realm of the world. And I wanted to react to the comment you made with respect to Dr. Khan's comment. I think whether the United States has abandoned Lebanon or not, that is probably the perception in the Muslim world today, because in the Muslim world, so many people think, even in places like Kuwait, where the United States still has a good image, that we unfairly support Israel. So I would think that in that dispute, I would think that what's bad for Israel, what makes Israel look bad in that world among the public, makes us, the United States, look bad.
Well, I was heartened to hear some Lebanese saying that it's time Hezbollah got out. And when you look back at the assassination of Hariri, maybe that was a turning point too. So I think it's a little more complex than just as simply as you lay it out there. But Mr. Chairman, I so appreciate this hearing. I know it's not well attended because there's so many competing things going on, but I've learned a lot, and I so appreciate this panel and your indulgence. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Boxer. I share your enthusiasm for this panel and the timeliness of the hearing, and I appreciate so much your presence.
Thank you. It would have been a little more lonely for you, I know.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're grateful because, and I would just say that Senator Boxer is a regular attender at our hearings, but nevertheless has, as I do, an intense interest in the issues that we have before us this morning. Let me begin my questioning by noting that the Aspen Institute, among other good things that it does, has a congressional program, and its study program following 9/11 proceeded to try to bring some instruction to members of Congress, Senate, and House about Islam. This is sort of basic training for many of us, and this is achieved through breakfast meetings here in the Capitol, and likewise through conferences in other countries. Recently we had at least several of us, 17 as I recall, were in Istanbul for a conference that brought together people from the area, as well as scholars from the United States and our own resources. Now, during these conferences, you mentioned, as I recall, Dr. Ahmed Karen Armstrong is one of the authors that you would recommend, and she has participated in our conferences, as have other scholars that you would recognize, and that has been helpful. Whenever any of their books arise, we are alert because we have heard the persons, have had some dialogue, and in the presence of people who had a variety of Muslim experiences, and that has been important, and that's a point that you have made, Dr. Khan, as well as you, Dr. Ahmed. Let me just say that, having said that, one of the themes of the early conferences came down to this thought, whether it's a 200-year separation and problem or whatever the time frame, that the Industrial Revolution proceeded in Europe and did not proceed, at least in the same form, in the Muslim world. That essentially Europeans, because of the modernity or what have you that came from the Industrial Revolution, gained wealth, gained substantial capital, and that did not occur in many states in the Middle East. And furthermore, there were different developments and attitudes toward women. In the most stark sense, Europeans would say we utilized a total workforce, and in some Arab and Muslim states, people would say we used half of the workforce. Women were not a part of this. Now, that overgeneralizes the situation, but nevertheless, very stark differences in attitudes. So as a result, at the end of the day, whether this is for good or for bad, a number of countries that appear to be in the West, in Europe, leaving aside the United States, appear to be doing reasonably well, and a lot of young people coming up in the Middle East do not appear to be doing very well, and don't have very much hope of doing very well under the current circumstances. Now, whether that is the basis for problems or not, the fact is that into this picture, about 60 years ago, we've learned in other hearings in this committee in which we have discussed energy to a fairly well. The United States and Saudi Arabia got together during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. We had mutual interests, and among them, perhaps paramount, was oil and the possibilities that had for us and for Europe and ultimately for Japan and for others who were in industrial situations. There was not necessarily a pact between the two countries, United States and Saudi Arabia, or any other particular countries, but nevertheless fairly well understood that those lines of oil were vital to us and the income to the rulers of Saudi Arabia, and as a result we began to take steps to make certain that continued. One can make a case that when we became heavily involved with the Shahs of Iran, we had similar thoughts. But in any event, we were involved. Now, this may be, for many in Congress now, became more acute as Iraq invaded Kuwait, and there were prospects that that invasion might proceed right on into Saudi Arabia and the oil fields there, quite apart from what was occurring in Kuwait. And President Bush, the first President Bush, talked about pushing back aggression. And we sought United Nations support to do that. We also sent as many as 500,000 American troops into the area. We were the only country that could do that, and it was one of the first manifestations of that essential point in world politics, that the United States alone really had that transporting quality, mobility, to tackle difficult problems, and that was one we decided to tackle. Rapidly, the Saudis, after some deliberation, decided that they would like for us to come to their defense, and we, in fact, began to put a good number of troops in Saudi Arabia. Now, after the war, the troops stayed in Saudi Arabia. Now, some who have testify before our committee, perhaps in less comprehensive form, have indicated that this is not necessarily when we caught the attention of Osama bin Laden, and his own history has been a source of considerable interest to the committee from time to time. His earlier beginnings, his work in African states, his work moving through many states for that matter, his relationship with his family in Saudi Arabia for that matter. But in any event, the question that I have really for all four of you to begin with is a part or a major part maybe of the American predicament, leaving aside any other country, the fact that there is considerable strategic resentment, not simply overall public relations problem, but strategic resentment of American military forces in the area who appear to be there, if not on a permanent basis, at least readily available to get there, given mobility of modern means, and who have in fact been there on a permanent basis in one form or another, despite destruction of barracks in Saudi Arabia, movement of troops to more secure locations in the course of time, all sorts of allegations to who really was responsible. Were Iranians involved, quite apart from persons in the Al-Qaeda movement or indigenous Saudi forces or whoever? That, in essence, is a part of our predicament, if not a major part, the fact that the United States has a reliance upon oil in that area, as does the rest of the world, and the rest of the world depends upon us to maintain the flow, as a matter of fact. When, for example, the other day, by that I mean 2 months or so ago, there was a rumor that terrorist forces, whoever they were coming down the road toward a refinery in Saudi Arabia that at least reportedly produces 13% of refined oil on any one day, in which the world has maybe a 2% discrepancy between supply and demand, so the knocking out of that sends chaos into the Western world. The good news was the terrorists were stopped, whoever they were, as the Saudis reported and indicated they had security there, but it was a shakeup. Prices of oil spiked. There was a recognition by the rest of the world that life as we know it in industrial Europe, Japan, the United States wouldn't come to an end, but would be severely dislocated. So as a result, armed forces are required to try to maintain these supply lines. So I suppose the basic question, is there any hope really for the reconciliation we're talking about today or movement, so long as this energy need remains, and the fact that the United States finds it incumbent to be present, really to protect our interest and finally others. I just add that the first George Bush financed the Kuwait Desert Storm situation through a vast international United Way campaign. I happened to be present with the President of the United States at that time when he got a call, which was vital, from the Prime Minister of Japan, informing the President of the first very generous contribution of Japan to this effort, which was followed by several more generous contributions, and saw really diplomacy at work in that way. Is there, I asked first of you, Dr. Hoffman, a way for reconciliation, goodwill, better opinion of everybody, quite apart from Al-Qaeda being on the march or not on the march, while we are there, and while there are vital interests that we feel we need to protect, as well as, for example, Saudi friends?
Well, your question is an excellent one, and it's obviously a very complex one. I think you're right, though, that at least historically, we've been examining early Al-Qaeda documents at RAND now for the better part of a year, and it seems quite clear that bin Laden was no friend of the United States from his formative period in Afghanistan, but it was really the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that was something of a fulminate. But I think it remained in the back of his mind until Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and we had the massive buildup, which on the one hand he thought the United States would never leave the region. On the other hand, he also thought, as you're zeroing in on, that this was part of the United States policy to extract from Muslims undervalued oil resources and energy resources, and this became one of his points of contention against the United States. I think the flashpoint for his turn to international or global terrorism was the influence of Ayman al-Zawahiri, his number two, who is an Egyptian head of an Egyptian Islamic Jihad terrorist group, where he began to at least implement this concept of a foreign and near enemy. And I think it was the failure of al-Zawahiri's group to overthrow the Mubarak regime in Egypt in the early 1990s that influenced bin Laden. Let's not deal with the near enemy, the local powers that whom they argued the United States props up and supports, but let's move to the puppet master in the back, and that focused on the United States. In responding to your question, I'm not an energy specialist at all, but I think you're hitting an important nail on the head, and that's we tend to look at all of these movements as monolithic, and we indeed buy, I think, the terrorist propaganda that they have a united, undivided front directed against us, when in fact I think very much the opposite is the truth, is that they're subject to the same divisions, especially the same very acute personality rivalries. I believe Abu Musab Zarqawi's rivalry with bin Laden and al-Zawahiri is an example of this. And I think that we're not as sensitive as we should be, largely as my colleagues on the panel have argued that, because there's I think, a large amount of our attitude towards the Middle East and towards the Muslim world that's based on conjecture rather than on a deep knowledge. And therefore, without this deep knowledge, this understanding, not just in detail of our adversary, which I think in this conflict is amongst the poorest we've ever faced. In Vietnam, for example, we encountered many frustrations, but one thing cannot be said of the U.S. effort, that we did not understand our adversary in the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong. There were detailed studies and interviews with thousands of Viet Cong detainees, so we built up a very clear picture, not just of how they operated and functioned and recruited, but of the divisions within their ranks, and then we could direct very, I think, finely calibrated and effective information operations and propaganda to drive even a wider wedge. So I think on the one hand, we haven't taken advantage of this same opportunity with many of the detainees we have in the war on terrorism and in Iraq to really understand our adversary. And I think, as we've heard from my three colleagues on the panel, we fundamentally don't understand the constituency in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, who we need to appeal to, who we need to enlist in the struggle, and rather in recent years we've inadvertently perhaps alienated.
Let me just pick up with Dr. Khan for a moment, this point from Dr. Hoffman's testimony. You made, I think, a very valid point, for instance, with the Karen Hughes operation, that she was not able to identify the Muslims on the staff. Perhaps they were not conspicuous or high up enough. But it's a more basic problem that Karen Hughes has. It seems to me, are hamstrung, as we've heard in these hearings, by our own problems of trying to identify people of any of the Muslim situations who are seen as reliable by our government, to the point, for example, that if Osama bin Laden were intercepted by the NSA on a tape, on his cell phone, it is always a question who would be able to translate what he had to say. Would we know really what the conversation was? Is the data mining sufficient finally, and are there enough people with language ability, interpreters, to try to fathom through this? Now, we get conflicting testimony. People say, well, you have to understand, we do background checks for people involved in intelligence or public relations, and so, and there are difficult aspects in these background checks. We find unusual people coming into the lives of these people, and therefore, what kind of reliance can you put on this sort of thing? It's a circular thing that goes round and around through perhaps ignorance of all the nuances here. But just as somebody who has studied this perhaps more carefully than most, how to begin to get some basis for enlisting people of Muslim faith, moderate or not, who are eager to really play a role in the United States government, to be able to assist us in whatever we're doing now.
Thank you very much. See, there is a very interesting dilemma that intelligence agencies and the U.S. government has. And the dilemma is that the most interesting people that will be most useful for the government are people who have interesting contacts back home.
Yes.
And they are the people that the government suspects the most.
Interesting histories.
Yes. So we need people who know radical Islamists, who know people who can call up Lebanon and find out whether the Lebanese army is supporting Hezbollah or not. The kind of person who can find that thing out for us is also the kind of person we would like to send to Guantanamo. Now, that is the whole dilemma for the U.S. government as to how to resolve this. Mm-hmm. And I heard that there are going to be changes at the Central Intelligence Agency on recruitment, and it's coming down the pipeline. Unfortunately, we have bureaucratic and legal issues which take a long time to come. But there are also several other issues. I think that U.S. Muslim relationships have been corrupted by oil to a great extent. It is like dating an exceptionally beautiful person, and what happens in that the physical beauty distracts from all the other qualities of the person. So when we started dating the Middle East, we only focused on oil. We have never seen them as human beings. The U.S. has had more closer diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia than with Israel, but there is no people-to-people relations between the people of Saudi Arabia and the American people. And this whole idea of looking at Islam and even American Muslims through the lens of the Middle East has created invisible barriers. American Muslims too made a big mistake. When they became politically active in this country and started trying to participate in its policy, they made the goal of reducing the influence of the Israeli lobby as one of their most important goals and making the Palestinian cause as the number one goal. It's like a flyweight boxer taking on a heavyweight boxer in their first bout. And as a result of that, the American Muslim community has not been able to approach the government and has remained a challenge and a critique and not a participant. And these are the two reasons why when Karen Hughes comes into this position, she does not know whom to hire and whom not to. I took her with me to the Islamic Society of North America, and there she made this very interesting comment. She said, "You have more credibility than I have in the Muslim world." And then she proceeded to travel to the Muslim world without any Muslims with her on the whole tour. And so I went on radio and I said, "Madam, you left your credibility behind." And this is
she left you behind, Dr. Khan.
Not me. There are two other comments that I wanted to add about your previous question to Dr. Hoffman. I think beyond the Iraq issue, there are two or three very clear issues which alienates Muslims from America. Muslims and third world countries have always admired America because America, in their mind, is a colony that made it big. A British colony that made it big. So can India, so can Egypt. So everybody looked up to the U.S. as a role model for development. But what has happened beyond Iraq, and keeping Iraq issue aside, is there are three things which has created a lot of resentment against America. Number one, Muslims tried in two different ways to develop in the last 50 years. One model was socialism, and it led to dictators like Nasser and Saddam Hussein, and so socialism failed them. The other alternative was Islamization, which never really got going because Muslims have seen the U.S. as a barrier to Islamization and therefore a barrier to development and modernization. Number two is the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict has been a source of pain, misery, and humiliation to Muslims all over the place. And that is very important to Muslims. While I was coming for this hearing, a Somalian cab driver was lecturing me on how I would be betraying Islam if I did not raise the Arab-Israeli issue in the Senate hearing. And so I am not betraying Islam. Number three, there is this perception in the Muslim world that the U.S. now is determined to keep the Muslim world weak. And therefore, while it looks the other way when Israel has nuclear weapons, is determined to go after Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, and prevent it. So these three perceptions, and it has not to do much with oil actually, these three perceptions have created a sense of resentment. And I think that there are two things that America can do to reverse this. One is to have a just solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict just now, as quickly as possible. The other is to develop a respect. We need to develop human-to-human contact. People have to know. When I travel to the Muslim world and listen to a lot of anti-Americanism, I start by saying this. I say, did you know that last year Americans gave over $250 billion in charity, in sadaqah, which is nearly twice the annual income of Saudi Arabia? That stuns them. It completely deconstructs their perception of Americans as immoral, because giving charity is a great, great value in Islam. It changes the way they think. They need to know about the softer side of America. And so does America needs to know the softer side of Muslims. Oil and Israel prevent us from doing that.
Well, maybe they do, and I suppose my first question was a suggestion that they do. But for the moment, it's not really clear to me how we get away from the oil. Now, this is sort of a passionate cause of my own, and will not bedraggle the hearing with this, because I think without a very sharp diminishment of the use of oil in this country, we are fated to have the sort of problems we're talking about today indefinitely. And this is simply a fact of life, and as a matter of fact, we have been through the process of talking about Ukraine and Russia and European business with natural gas. Well, the facts of life are the strategic use of oil. Increasingly, as Iran becomes more wealthy, leaving aside the Saudis or anybody else, it creates very great dilemmas for us. Now, on the other hand, we have a strategic alliance with Israel, an affinity there that is important to most Americans, and is not going to go away, it's not going to diminish. So we make the case again. Perhaps we will have the wisdom for a peace process, for ceasefires, for some diminishment of this, and we all pray that that's the case almost every day. But how factually that comes about, hard to come by. We started our day in the committee hosting the Egyptian foreign minister and other ministers that are here for talks on strategy with the United States, and they were tremendously interesting with their insights on the ceasefire business, or how in the world you begin to separate the parties in Lebanon, quite apart from Syria, quite apart from any place else. We always are eager to get advice, but I came away from that meeting as well as I really, and at this point, not really sure how, if these are the problems with regard to public opinion, and beyond that, simply the emotions, we separate ourselves very rapidly. Now, maybe, as you've suggested, Dr. Khan, if our generosity to countries was more apparent, as Kohut has mentioned, Indonesia looking a little better, at least those parts of it, I suppose, that were helped after the tsunami. And that would be true in Pakistan, where relief came to people up in the mountains. Clearly, if we were more adept at our public diplomacy, as you've suggested, our generosity to other places in the Middle East has been profound. And so the word needs to get out. We need to be better at this. But I just keep circling around sort of basic problems that are in the way of all of this resolving itself very rapidly.
Let me give you a small suggestion. Like, for example, who is going to rebuild Lebanon? Do we wait till Iran provides some funding to reconstruct Lebanon? A decision by the United States now to say that once there is ceasefire and Hezbollah is either dismantled or moved further away so that it cannot threaten northern Israel, the United States will be willing to reconstruct the damage that Israel made in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's probably a good idea, but let me just ask the matter of practical politics to any of you. Who in the world is governing Lebanon at this point? Even if we were to make these pledges, where is there a government that has enough profound influence throughout all the precincts of Lebanon that any American statesperson, contractor, a soldier, what have you, would be safe in the place? In other words, as I listened to the Egyptians talking today about rockets in the houses of people in Lebanon, up and down the street and so forth, being utilized by the powers that be that are firing at the Israelis and so forth, I'm not sure who are the Lebanese. Where is the governance of and where do the Syrians come into this? Are they out of it? Are they into it? Should they be back into it? In other words, I think your point is well taken, but trying to separate all the parties here so that we have at least some possibility of doing good is not really clear in my mind. Anybody else offer some clarity as to how?
Yes, Chairman, I want to make a comment related to the discussion. You not only have Lebanon, Turkey has issued a statement that it is now looking at the Kurdish incursions into Turkey and seriously considering going in. India and Pakistan are once again heating up in terms of the rhetoric between the two countries, and the two giants, both nuclear, 3 wars between them. What Iraq has established is a precedent, and that is so dangerous. The United States, in this situation, as the sole superpower, needs to be acting, needs to be thinking 3 steps before something takes place, rather than reacting. It just cannot afford it. It's too big. There's the oil tanker in a small pond. Now, the situation is that you've got Iraq, you have Iran, Syria being involved, Iran being involved. And on my travels, I discovered that a lot of Sunnis, and this is an important nuance in the Muslim world, the Shia-Sunni nuance, a lot of Sunnis were referring to Ahmadinejad as the role model. Now, why? Osama bin Laden, who's a Sunni, is understandable simply because he's standing up to the United States. So the United States needs to be aware of the trends and move ahead of the trend, the graph itself. It cannot wait for events. It cannot say, let us see what is happening in Lebanon, because Turkey may unravel soon. Suppose India now says, all right, cross-border terrorism, we are crossing into Pakistan. Pakistan is 165 million people. It's nuclear. It'll tilt everything that you're doing in that part of the world. So, putting it in the context of the Middle East, and I know that this is a major concern, the oil and the oil links, and Central Asia, both major oil-producing zones, where the United States does not have the option of cutting and running. It just doesn't. But it does have the option of changing strategy, of playing the game by the rules as they are played in that part of the world, what the British, if you recall, called the Great Game. That part of the world has seen all the great conquerors coming and going, from Alexander to Temur to Genghis Khan. We have now the United States Army there, the most powerful army in the world today. What are the rules there? You need to make allies who respect you. You need to have a word which is respected. Right now there's a feeling, even in the close allies that you have, apart from the governments who may be allies, and I don't know how loyal they would be if aid stopped, but the people certainly feel that the United States is a fair weather friend, that when policy changes, they'll just dump you and walk away, as the Afghans felt. In the 1980s, the Afghans were the most loyal allies of the United States. They fought the war with the United States against the Soviets. 1/3 of the Afghan population has lost a limb. They were the freedom fighters. In the 1990s, they became the Taliban. Bin Laden is of that generation and from that school, if you like. So the need to keep allies and friends and recognize them, to play a long-term game. These are rules of the great game. And thirdly, to learn to play the game through the culture of honor and respect and tradition. Because if we don't honor people there, if there are stories of rape, that is crossing the border. And then this talk of jihadist, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda is meaningless. Every Muslim, whether he's Orthodox or secular or mystic, is horrified, as indeed is every good Christian or every good Jew, as every good secularist even, when rape is committed of the kind that we are hearing emerging from these horror stories. So if we are conscious of the great game, if our soldiers abroad, diplomats abroad, are realizing that this is a long-term game strategy, we cannot opt out of it, because if we pull out, there's a huge vacuum, Middle East, Central Asia. Think about it, Mr. Chairman. You have 2 other local superpowers waiting to emerge, Russia and China, both who played the game for the last 2 centuries, Imperial Russia, Imperial China. And in the 21st century, 2 decades, 3 decades down the road, if America is not aware of the game, playing by strange rules there, they're playing cricket, you're playing baseball, very different kinds of rules, and if you cut and run, you may have a situation where in this vacuum you will get powers that may not be friendly to interests that the United States represents. And to me, ultimately, what the United States does represent is human rights, democracy, the ideals of the founding fathers. That is the vision and the dream we constantly need to come back to and share with the Muslim world. That message, that bridge is not coming across, and that needs to be reinforced.
I appreciate that statement because it certainly is important in terms of the debate we're having in this country, which you witness. We have a fairly large percentage of the public and a fair number of members of Congress who, as a matter of fact, wouldn't call it cutting and running, but they want to get out. They would say, despite all the obligations you've suggested, even the possibilities of a vacuum being created with Russia and China and all the rest, that as far as they're concerned, we've had enough. People don't like us. They are attempting to subvert whatever we have to do, distorting what we believe we are, and they ought to just proceed, do the best they can. Now, I don't think that side will prevail, but I'm not overconfident. In part, a number of our congressional elections, in which all of us are involved in 16 weeks, are on these sorts of issues, in which things are polarized, just around those points. So that what we're talking about today does have long-run circumstances, but it also has some short-term volatility in our own politics, leaving aside whatever is happening in the Middle East. Let me just ask you, Mr. Kohut, you've been pondering over all of this argument for a while, but we'd like for your counsel as to what you've heard.
Well, one thing that's clear is that of all the things that you mentioned in your set of questions, that the war in Iraq has made all of this worse. It's poisoned the well. I don't think that while Osama bin Laden and his ilk had issues with Americans on the ground in Saudi Arabia through the 90s, that certainly probably wasn't the case in the Muslim world writ large. It wasn't the case in Turkey, where we had a very positive image. It wasn't the case in Jordan and other places. I think, though, that the presence of American troops in Iraq raises the issue of Americans in the Middle East, and that makes the American presence there more broadly more of an issue. Similarly, while, as Dr. Khan said, we were seen as dating for purposes of oil, oil is even more, there's even more skepticism about our motives and intentions because of the war in Iraq. All of these things have just become worse, and increasingly what we see in I'm not saying the Arab world, the Muslim world, is an us versus them phenomenon. And one of the ways that came through is when we did our poll earlier this year about Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. There was tremendous opposition to that idea in the West and most parts of the world. But not really tremendous opposition among Iran's Sunni neighbors in Egypt and Jordan. There was a mixed opinion, in some respects support. It's a very, very negative situation that will require some dramatic success for the United States in the eyes of the Muslim publics, and what that is, I don't know.
Well, we very much appreciate your testimony, your response to our questions, and we'll try to make as complete a committee record of this hearing as we can, because you have said things that are important for all of our colleagues and perhaps the public as a whole that takes a look at these hearings to the benefit of C-SPAN or however. These are important moments for us to try to concentrate on what you have to say and to reread it and to try to think about some of the other sources that you have cited. So this will not be our concluding hearing on this subject. This is an education process, as I've indicated, for each one of us who needs to know more, needs to be visiting with people such as yourselves, as you're able to give us this time. And we certainly thank you for your generosity this morning. So saying, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's why no one is replacing ours with someone else.
What?
Today on Washington Journal, we'll get different views on the Middle East conflict.